Well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today on the Conscientious Emigrant with Arturo Dominguez and me. And if you don't mind, if you have an available finger and you don't mind tapping the heart in the comments, I am told that this helps our algorithmic reach. So
Yeah.
tap that heart by the chat if you feel so inclined. And I'll go ahead and hand it over to Arturo to introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce myself briefly.
Yeah. So I'm Arturo Dominguez. I write the Decolonized Journalism newsletter, editor in chief at the Antagonist Mag, which is basically where I cross post all my stuff on the open internet. So it's not kind of in a walled garden all the time. Um, I've written for, Unicorn Riot and several outlets here in the US and a few outlets overseas, Orinoco Tribune and some outlets in Cuba. Aside from that, just kind of out here doing my thing. At the moment, my focus has been on Cuba, trying to protect my people and stuff from,
Yeah.
what everybody sees is happening. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're Cuban American, like you were born in the US
Yeah.
and your ancestry is Cuban. Okay. Yeah. I wasn't sure whether you migrated to the US. Okay. So you're Cuban American and you still have a lot of family back in Cuba, right?
Yeah. A lot. Yeah. There's a ton.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you again for joining us. And I'm Elizabeth Solik LaRue. I guess I'm the, I don't know how to, I don't, I'm still trying to figure out how to explain what I do, but I help people emigrate from the United States. I specifically, our brand or whatever, our trademark is Conscientious Emigration, which is really centered around helping people from the US leave with an intentional approach to their environmental, economic, and cultural impacts abroad. And this, Arturo's work, first of all, I've been following his work from before I started doing the Conscientious Emigration consulting and writing in 2024. We moved to Mexico. Me and my husband moved to Mexico in 2022. But I have been following Arturo's work because I have always worked on issues of equity, issues of environmental justice, specifically in my career. And I just remember the first time I saw something that you wrote and it said decolonized journalism. And I was like, oh, cool, because this was years ago when like people in the DEI circles and stuff weren't really acknowledging colonialism. Like it was very US centric and they were and a lot of the discourse around race and gender and sort of systems of oppression seemed to ignore early history in the United States, right? And didn't really talk a lot about global colonialism. And that's a huge piece of this puzzle. And of course, when we're talking about people from the United States emigrating throughout the world, and particularly to countries that have been formerly colonized by Europe largely, there are power dynamics there that you have to navigate, economic power dynamics, racial power dynamics, passport privilege, all of these things that you kind of need to or that you should navigate if you don't want to perpetuate the same sort of oppressive and, elitist behaviors where you're going. So yeah, I've always loved your approach to kind of acknowledging that colonial history. And given what's been going on by virtue of the United States inflicting itself, right, inflicting its policies on Latin American nations, the most obvious being the bombing of Venezuela, the drone strikes throughout the Caribbean, and the Pacific, the whole oceanic area around here, the blockades, and however you want to characterize what they're doing to Cuba. I mean, it's more than just blockades, right? It's like
Yeah.
deliberate strangulation and starvation. And then, of course, the interference that has happened in Mexico, or I don't know if I would call it interference, but the pressure that the United States government is putting Mexico under. And then all of the election interference that we know has been partially, or if not wholly, responsible for these right-wing elections
Yeah.
across region. All of that's happening, right? And
Right,
those
right.
that live, I live in Mexico. We've been living in Mexico for going on 4 years. We love it here. We have no plans to leave. But it's I know that people are asking themselves and they're asking me, is it still safe to move to this region? What does it mean to move to this region in this context? All of that. So, I kind of wanted to, first of all, start with a little bit of the history that I've seen you write about. And I linked to a couple of your articles about the history of US imperialism and destabilization and sort of the way that the United States has positioned itself to rule this hemisphere. Tell us a little bit about that in your perspective on it.
Well, this goes back to 1823, I believe, the Monroe Doctrine,
Mhm.
where, President Monroe was basically asserting dominance over Latin America. And, it was framed under the idea of keeping European powers out, the colonialist powers, for example,
Mm.
out of Latin America, right? So they took this, sort of almost, we want to decolonize Latin America. But the reality was that they wanted to replace the colonizers in Latin America and be more of an imperialist power.
Mhm.
So, essentially, I use the word dominion a lot because it is based on religious motivations, under the guise of Christianity and, the ideas of manifest destiny, the divine right to take over people's lands and things like that. So I
Mhm.
use dominion a lot, and I use it kind of interchangeably with imperialism for that reason. Um, but yeah, the history there it was pretty deep. There was the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially, exerted more authority, perceived
Mm.
authority over Latin
So it's an
America.
expansion.
Right, right. And then, Donald Trump did one recently, and his was, 3 paragraphs, maybe 300 words. The Monroe Doctrine and the corollaries, those were all presented to Congress and, big State of the Union addresses, things like that. And those were a big deal. Trump's kind of went under the radar just
Mhm.
because it was, basic 300-word little thing he posted on the website, on the White
Mhm.
House site. And the thing about it is that it's so vaguely worded that it essentially takes everything Monroe and Roosevelt were considering about Latin America and uh, putting military power behind it. So
Mm. Wow.
no, this peace through strength nonsense, war is peace, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
Real 1984 type stuff. But yeah, the corollary that Trump issued is as well, military power. We saw it with the Shield of the Americas recently, where
Mhm.
only far right presidents were involved. People that are
Mhm.
like, Trump sycophants and stuff. They didn't invite Mexico. They didn't invite Brazil, the two biggest
Mhm.
economies in the region. Um,
Mhm.
it kind
And they're
of,
doing the same. Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, but this is important because I actually did not know that the positioning or the characterization of the initial imperialist movement was, oh, we're decolonizing and separating from Europe. And when you said that, I'm thinking that's exactly how they're trying to spin this vis-a-vis China, right? Oh, well, we want to make sure that China doesn't come over here and, like as if they care about China's impacts on Latin America. It doesn't come over here and, uh, uh, assert power that belongs to us. That's really because I feel like that's the type of talking point that can sway a person that doesn't have a lot of education in these matters. You know what I mean? And has been like has been like, oh well, China's scary, and China is scary. I mean, I'm not gonna lie, like China's
yeah,
got some very authoritarian leanings, right? We know that. And when you don't know the whole picture and you don't understand that that's just being used to manipulate you into supporting this military force against the region, you can easily find yourself being a little bit like, oh well, I guess that's okay. you know.
right. And that's the thing. It's kind of been normalized so much that, and it's a thing that a topic that isn't really discussed in the United States. So, in the U.S., you tend to overlook these things. You know, like we tend to overlook like the actual extent, for example, of the economic embargo on Cuba. Everybody knows, yeah, the U.S. is somewhat responsible, but even a lot of people who support lifting the embargo don't understand the complexities of it and how deep it really goes.
Yeah.
The same thing can be said for U.S. Mexico foreign policy, um,
Mhm.
and for foreign policy in Latin America in general, and even
Mhm.
with China, like you mentioned, and Iran, same thing. You know,
Mhm.
we weaponize these issues and make them bigger than they are. And
Mhm.
when I say we, I mean the U.S. government
Mhm.
weaponizes these issues and makes them bigger than they are, and they use that as rationalization and justification to bomb these countries. And
Mhm.
it's a lot of people are catching on, right? Because we have the internet now. We didn't have the internet as much after 9/11, right? For the Iraq wars.
Mhm.
But now people are seeing it. It's right in front of our face. Like, how can you claim to be liberating somebody while dropping bombs on them?
Mhm.
You know, and that's that duplicity of our foreign policy. It's hypocritical. You know,
Yeah.
it doesn't jive with reality. And then
Yeah.
people are starting to see that. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing that I've noticed seems to cut across these discrete instances of U.S. imperialism is leveraging the voices of immigrants from those countries that have come into the United States. We know this with white Cubans, right?
Right.
Like big time with white Cubans in South Florida. Like, immigrants that have left their countries and, oftentimes they had good reasons, right? Like, I'm not going to talk about Cuba because that's a whole other ballgame. But let's say, for example, people who have left Iran, right? And women, I know Iranian women who fled in their childhood and they're like, that regime is horrible and that regime is committing human rights abuses. And, it needs to stop. Like theocratic rule needs to stop. And misogyny baked into law needs to stop. But they're leveraging those voices to then say, and that's why we should go bomb them. And that's
Right.
not,
Right.
I mean, there's the occasional person in the United States that says, yeah, go bomb them. But most of the time, people, even when people acknowledge that the government that, they fled from, that was oppressive, needs to be changed, they don't necessarily advocate going and dropping bombs on people. And people who know anything about global politics know that, moving decapitation, as they say, removing a head of state is not going to solve the underlying problem. It never has, it never will. So, yeah, but so America, we've seen this, the Shield of the Americas summit happened. As you said, it was all Trump sycophants. It was all, right wingers that attended. He claims that Uruguay signed on to this this
Yeah.
proposal, but when I searched for that, the only when I was searching for any evidence that they actually did that, the only thing that came up was your article saying Trump said that they did.
Right.
Like, okay, did they really? Because they're pretty, tied to their democratic ideals. Like, that would surprise me. But in any event, we see this right wing wave sweeping. But there's also something I want to unpack that I've heard you say before in other talks, and I've seen you written, which is that right wing in a Latin American context is like left wing in a United States context. And I
Yeah.
don't know, to elaborate a little bit on that because I've
Yeah.
heard you
So
say.
it's crazy. Okay, so like a lot of my work is read in like over I think 109 countries now. So I get a lot of this from all over the world. Honestly, I thought it was just Latin America, where basically Bill Clinton would be a conservative in Latin America,
Yeah.
and Republicans would be extreme right wing, and then Bernie Sanders and AOC are center left at best. And
Mhm.
I've always known that about Latin America, right? And in Latin America, red means left and blue means right. So it's backwards from ours, and it's
Mhm.
it's that way a lot in much of the world too. And
Mhm.
I hear that all the time. And this is why in Latin America you hear the word neoliberalism a lot, and that's because they don't see the difference between U.S. conservatism and and liberalism.
Mm.
And conservatism in the United States is basically that they treat it the same way. They don't see the difference between the two. And when it comes, especially when it comes to foreign policy, there really isn't any difference. You see a lot of Democrats are hemming and hawing about Trump, and he needs to explain to the people and justify this war and all these things. And what they're telling them is, this is what you have to do to try to sell the people on this war. They're giving them
Mm.
instructions, right? And you kind of see this duplicity in liberal politics. Like, for example, today's the 30th anniversary of when Bill Clinton signed the Helms-Burton Act. The
I'm
Helms-Burton
sorry,
Act.
say that one more time. I didn't catch that.
Today's the 30th anniversary of the day that Bill Clinton signed the Helms-Burton Act.
Oh,
And
okay. Okay.
yeah, and the Helms-Burton Act codified into law the economic embargo of Cuba, and it punishes other people for doing business with Cuba.
Right.
So if a ship, for example, a cargo ship goes to Cuba, delivers goods for whatever reason, they can't dock in the United States for 6 months. That's because
Mhm.
of the Helms-Burton Act. Nobody wants to take that risk and then lose all that money. So, there's this bipartisanship when it comes to foreign policy. And, you see these justifications even from like Chuck Schumer before we started bombing Iran. He was mad at Trump for holding some sort of side talks with
Mhm.
the Iranian government. And, he was displeased with that. He was all about going to war and all that stuff. But, ultimately Trump's going to do what he's going to do. The White House doesn't care about international law, domestic law, any of that stuff. So,
No.
you saw that when we kidnapped Maduro. You saw that. I mean, say what you will about the guy. He had a lot of support in Venezuela. And unfortunately, they kidnapped him. And people are pretty pissed about that in Venezuela.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, yeah, it's this weird thing that when you look at the view from Latin America, politics in the United States is basically just one uniparty type situation.
That's so fascinating to me. I mean, I see it now. I think I see that a little bit now more, having lived a couple years in Mexico, like how it like when I talk to people who are from here, have lived here forever and never lived anywhere else, right? It when we talk politics, they don't differentiate, between
Right.
like it's just the U.S. government. And yes, they like people acknowledge that Trump is a clown and totally
Right.
obnoxious and a horrible, like vile, disgusting grosero that nobody would want sitting around their table. Like people get that. But in terms of like the larger political I don't know, template of the US. It's just sort of like that's Americans. That's how
Right.
the US operates. And it's interesting that whole like when you were talking about the idea, of that anybody who does business with our enemy, the Cuba, is then going to be penalized, which of course Mexico is constantly subject to because Mexico does
Right.
have a really strong relationship with Cuba. It gives such mafia vibes to me. It's ironic because that's such a cartel mafioso mentality. You don't do business with my enemies. If you do business with my enemies, then you're my enemy. Like that, it's just so it's so what's the word I'm looking for? Like it's so like caveman. It's
Right.
just so
Right.
unsophisticated and so it's such an inappropriate way to handle diplomatic relations across countries. It's such a like it's just lowbrow. I don't know.
Yeah. And
You know?
it's just funny because, if they try to make everything so black and white, and
Yeah.
there's so much nuance, you know what I mean? So, everything the government says about Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, like all these countries, 90% of it is propaganda, right? There's like a grain of truth in most of it. And then they hyperbolize or whatever. They're hyperbolic about it. Anyway,
Absolutely.
um,
Absolutely.
and it's just so much more, so to really find the truth of what's going on, a lot of times you have to like listen to the US government's propaganda, listen to Iran's or Cuba's propaganda, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So
Yep.
and 9 times out of 10, and this is what I find really funny and fascinating at the same time, is 9 times out of 10 US media will tell you that anything else aside from their reporting is propaganda. And
Mhm.
And what I think is funny is that they're trying to keep you from hearing the other side,
Mhm.
and they're silencing the people that are being killed, basically. And
Of
and they
course.
don't, they just don't want you to hear what other people are saying. You know, they dehumanize brown people in our media nonstop, right? Whether it's Iranians or Mexicans or Latinos in general, you
Mhm.
know, they all participate in this whole criminal migrant nonsense, and none of
Mhm.
them can define what a criminal migrant is, by the way. But they like to use the phrase, and that just paints a picture to liberals and conservatives that migrants are criminals.
Yeah.
You know, crossing the border and claiming asylum is not illegal. And if you're in the system, you're not undocumented. You know, if you have a pending case, you're very well documented, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this weird language that we use to like dehumanize brown people, and then when it comes to war with them, they don't want you to listen to the other side of the story.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a just weird dynamic.
You know what I find really ironic about that the criminalization of migrants, that whole stereotyping is that there's actually so many criminals that flee the United States to go live in Latin America, and I mean, literally, the new president that the US helped install in Chile, right?
Yeah,
His father was a literal Nazi.
right.
A literal Nazi. He
Not a
fled Europe
right.
because he was a literal
Right.
Nazi.
Not a neo-Nazi, not we're not saying that hyperbolically. He was a
Nope.
literal
He
Nazi.
was
Yeah.
one of the Nazi parties, and
Praise
he
the Lord.
fled to South America and gave, obviously impregnated somebody and gave birth to this child. And I mean, if he fled Europe as a Nazi, he brought those views with him.
Oh, of course.
He raised his child. I mean, caste is just another white supremacist. And you see that, and that for being here in Mexico and growing up around so many people from Latin America, like, and knowing that people from the US and Europe have historically and traditionally used the anonymity that they were able to acquire in Latin America to flee accountability for their crimes in the United States and Europe. So
Yeah,
that whole criminal migrant, it's almost like that. Mm, are you
right.
sure you're talking about yourself?
Right. And what's funny is like I'm on the press list with basically every agency under DHS, and people would be amazed at how often I get emails about American citizens getting caught trying to bail to Mexico or fleeing sexual assault charges or child molestation charges. And, you know, they have pending cases that haven't made it to court yet, and they get caught trying to cross the border. And more times than not, they're caught by Mexican authorities and given back to Border Patrol. But like, this dude's a pedophile. You need to throw his ass in jail. And
Yeah.
it's just crazy to me how often that happens.
Yeah.
But I mean, at least once a week, somebody's getting caught trying to flee to Mexico,
You
and I'm
gotta
like,
publicize that when you see it, because that narrative needs to be the
right,
narrative needs to be combated and the truth needs to be shown. And of course, yes, there are criminals in Mexico that are Mexican.
right,
Obviously, of course, that's every single place, but you never hear about the reverse, or the reverse is always
right,
it's always couched as some exception. And I'm like, nah, I walk around here, trust me. I see dudes from the United States that I'm like, there's no way you
yeah,
don't have
right.
there's
Something's
no way you
going
don't have a record. You didn't walk through life with that tattoo on your face. Nah, you got a record.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
and it's just, it's yeah. To your point about hyperbole, I want to talk about this real quick because it's been almost a month now, right, since El Mencho in Mexico was captured, that, and then the next day, Lord, I threw on Substack. I had to reel myself in because you have people sitting up there in the United States, people who I know they don't know anything about Mexico.
right,
I know they probably never even visited here. Maybe if they did, they went to an all inclusive, and they're sitting up there, and their headline is "Mexico's on fire."
yeah,
Why don't you sit down and talk about what you know? That really irritated me because I'm sitting here and I'm like, obviously I have clients in the Puerto Vallarta area. I have clients in Jalisco. Well, Jalisco is the whole state, but like adjacent to Guadalajara. So of course I'm like really concerned. I'm concerned for our well-being. I'm concerned for them. I'm checking in with people, I'm finding out everyone's fine.
Right.
Like the only people who were killed were law enforcement, which is sad but then again, it's a job that when you take that job, you know the risks that you're entailing. And then people who are part of the cartel, again, you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Like that's the same everywhere you go. I grew up in New York. I know people that were
Right.
gay, they got killed. Well, that's what's going to happen. You know what I mean? Like you get involved in that, you're basically, you're going to end up in jail or dead. That's no surprise. There was one civilian that was caught in the crossfire, which is obviously tragic, right? But the way that people were talking about it, like, as they were talking about it as if it was a situation like what was going on in Iran, with the government shooting people down and slaughtering
Right.
protesters.
Right.
None of that was going on. It wasn't any of that. There were actually, and I spoke to individual people who are real people who I know that told me that people that they know were evacuated from Oxo, the convenience store here, evacuated from Oxo, evacuated from their cars, told, get out of here, get what you need and leave because we're going to burn the store down. Now, to me, that's discipline. That's
Right.
tactical. And that is the opposite of what you see when there is a violent catastrophe that happens in the United States. When you see a mass shooter in the United States, affiliated or non affiliated with organized crime, they're going for maximum damage to human life.
Right.
They're trying to kill as many people as possible. This was the opposite. They were actually trying to reduce civilian casualties by evacuating people. And I'm like, look, this is the reality of our situation. That's not an ideal thing to have cartels, burning
Right.
vehicles in the street and burning down buildings. But as between somebody that's going to come over and tell me, go get your stuff and get out because I'm about to burn this building down, go home and be safe. And being in a supermarket in Buffalo in New York, a school in Texas, a nightclub in Florida, take your pick, where some crazy person can just go get a gun, come in and shoot everybody up, maximum carnage, and then walk out half the time.
Yeah.
Walk out, you know, look at Kyle Rittenhouse. I mean,
Right.
A murderer, and the police are welcoming it. It's no comparison to me.
Right. And I think the difference is too, you know, cartels are in a war with the state, not with the people of the community. So that's one reason why they tell people get out of the way. Aside, if they did kill civilians, it makes them look bad. And cartels politic. They help their community. They feed the poor. They do a lot of these things for a reason, so that
Mhm,
some people will help provide cover.
mhm,
It's a sort of a mutually beneficial thing for people who are struggling.
mm.
Um, but let's not pretend we don't have cartels in the United States. We just don't call them cartels, right?
They're called the mafias,
Right.
gangs.
Like we have this thing. Okay, it's called the Dixie Mafia, right? And it's not like a mafia type thing. It's basically all these smaller organized crime syndicates, mostly in the South, and they have agreements that cross state lines, and that's how they transport drugs and things like that. The biggest
Mhm,
drug traffickers in Texas, for example, are like the Aryan Brotherhood, and they buy methamphetamine from the cartel and they distribute it all over the state.
mhm,
These racist groups, for example, like the Aryan Brotherhood, like they don't care if the person they're buying their drugs from are Mexican or black people. It's about money. They
yep,
want to protect their white race, whatever the little thing is, but it's about money at the end of the day. And
mhm.
they do business with whoever. And like, there's been so many documentaries and so many stories about these task forces targeting smuggling networks here in Texas. And it almost always includes the Aryan Brotherhood.
Wow.
And, that started as a prison gang and is now in our streets all over the state. The state's divided up into 5 different little areas, and they have generals and all these things. And all this stuff has been discussed in the public. And, I find it funny when you see people in the US talking about cartels in Mexico and they refuse to address the problem we have right here. Uh,
And they will never accept that
right.
trope as the truth. Like they will never, like they'll gratefully and gladly glom on to a trope about Haitian people eating dogs,
Right.
right? But if you start talking about the fact that in certain parts of the country, the actual drug war should be fought against white supremacist criminal organized crime groups, they won't accept that. They like
Right.
there's still this the indoctrination of white supremacy in the United States is so strong that there's still this assumption of legality and integrity and sort of legitimacy
Right.
among groups of white people regardless of what they're actually doing. And it's that thank God that's something that I can say that we have escaped, right? I don't believe, at least where we live in Mexico, Quintana Roo is very, very heavily dominated by people with Mayan ancestry. There's very few like white skinned Latinos where we live. And so I don't tend to see, or I don't feel like there's this automatic credence attached to whiteness in the way that there is in the United States. And my husband doesn't either, and he's black. So, he's always like, wow, like I can't believe how nice these people have been to me. I can't believe that I went here and I didn't know what I was doing and they just helped me and they didn't treat me like any. He went to a boxing class this morning and he's, boxing with local people and it's just there's none of that. There's none of that you know, suspicion and I mean, we don't know if whether there is or not, right? You can't read people's minds, but the point is the behavior, right? The behavior it makes us feel safe. The behavior is not harmful.
Right. Right. And there's some things that you can't get rid of, and that's prejudice and discrimination. Right. Like people are gonna be they're gonna have their own biases, their implicit biases and things like that. As long as they're not I say this all the time. I don't care if you're racist. If you're sitting at home in your single wide trailer and you're lazy boy and you're using that word, I don't give a damn. It's the minute you try to
Mhm.
weaponize that and try to harm somebody that it
Yep.
becomes a problem for me.
Yeah.
So like you can, and people are going to have those views or whatever, but it's one of the things about like my decolonization journey has been motivated through the viewpoint of Latin America, where decolonization has been in the process for over 100 years. And
Hmm.
I did for Unicorn Riot. I interviewed an indigenous leader in the western part of Canada, and
Mm.
decolonization in Canada is a little bit ahead of us in a lot of
Hmm.
ways, but not as far advanced as Latin America. So, like when I talk about Ecuador, for example, almost everybody I talk to in Ecuador are indigenous from one tribe or another.
Yeah.
Honduras, same thing. Mexico,
Yeah.
a lot of people I talk to are, indigenous.
Hmm.
You look at even in Cuba where, it's a mostly non-white population. Most are mixed. And there's, a sizable Afro-Cuban population. But
Hmm.
even there, the racism issue, there's discrimination cases here and there, but the racism issue isn't what it is here. You don't see an Afro-Cuban walking down the street and, you don't see Cubans crossing the street to avoid it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
the this
Yeah.
the things you see in the US just don't exist anywhere. And that's not to
No.
say racism doesn't exist in Latin America because it does. I mean, in Brazil, if you use a racial slur, is a crime. You go to
Mhm.
jail. So
Wow.
right. So racism in Latin America is still a problem, but at least you know those countries are doing stuff to address it.
Yeah.
We're not. We're
And
trying
it's a
to
spectrum.
right, right.
Like
The United States
racism
is
is a spectrum, like
right.
the thing that
It's
like when people try to tell me, and it's always white people, right? Sorry to say, but it's always white people and including white Latinos from the US that will say, you know, um, well, y- racism is the same in Mexico. And I'm like, you want to tell that to the black people who are living who
right.
moved from the United States South and are living in Merida, in Mexico City, and whatever, and they're like, "Oh my God, I can walk down the street and see a police officer and say hi to them and keep it moving. Oh my God, I can walk into a store and buy something and they actually treat me with respect. Like,
Right.
people that don't have any concept of what the impacts of racism, especially anti-Black racism in the United States actually looks and feels like, are quick to jump onto this narrative that, well, racism is everywhere. Well, so is misogyny, right? But
Right.
I can
Right.
drive here. I can't drive in Qatar. I went to Qatar years ago to go visit a boyfriend that was living there. I wasn't allowed to drive. I wasn't allowed to, be out by myself. So yeah, misogyny exists everywhere, but it's a spectrum. I can vote here. I have bodily autonomy. Like, come on.
Right. Right.
For sure, everything bad is everywhere, but there are grades. There are grades.
Yeah,
Um,
you could say like the machismo factor, right? In basically every Latino community, there's this machismo issue.
and there is.
But how many women presidents has Latin America already seen compared to us?
Thank
You know
you.
what I mean? So you can't
Thank
you
you.
can say misogyny exists everywhere, but like it's a right. There are levels to everything. That's what I always used to tell my kids. There are levels to everything,
Yep.
and it is. It's a spectrum. And
Yep.
sure, there's probably some misogyny and misogynoir and all that stuff in Mexico, but
Mhm.
look who the president is, right? Like
Mhm.
we can't overcome that hurdle. And we
Yeah.
just saw that recently in the primary, the Democrat primary in Texas, when it was Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico, and
Mhm.
everybody outside of Texas was telling us how we need a white man to be able to win. And none of them acknowledged that the last white man to run for Senate lost to a Latino. So, you know what I mean? Like the
Yeah.
misogyny is deep in our politics, in our social structure,
Mhm.
and it manifests everywhere. And I'm not so sure that liberals even realized how misogynistic it was to say we need a white man to win, not a black woman. I mean, that's straight
Mhm.
misogynoir,
Mhm.
anti-black,
Mhm.
anti-woman. Like it's so
They
deep.
know. They know. They just
Yeah.
characterize it as being strategic. It's the same old shit. Listen, to your point, like, our governor of our state is also a woman, in addition to having a woman president in Mexico. And honestly, like, yes, there is machismo alive and well for sure.
Yeah.
However, the only person, since I've been living here almost 4 years, the only person to ever say anything remotely sexist to me was my white American neighbor, who actually didn't say it to me. He said it to my husband, control your woman.
Oh my
Okay.
God.
So,
Oh
you know,
my God.
yeah, whatever. I mean, he's a running joke. He's a running joke. But yeah, like, the point being that, yes, machismo exists, but also women are in positions of power here. And,
Right, right.
I you can just look at, like, our suite of people that we deal with on a regular basis, doctors, accountants, just like the professional people that we go to are largely women here in Mexico. Mexican women can be super powerhouses. My landlord's a woman. Like, there's a lot of women that we've met in this area that, they're probably outliers, you know what I mean? Like I am, like, they're unusually powerful women, but they're here and nobody's stopping them.
Right.
Meanwhile, in the United States, you have the Heritage Foundation over here trying to roll back the most basic things, birth control, I mean, Mexico decriminalized abortion a couple years ago, and
Right.
meanwhile, we're going the opposite direction in the U.S. But since we're getting, we have about 20 minutes left, and I want to talk a little bit about people who are thinking. First of all, as you know, I only deal with people who really understand this stuff, to some degree, that understand, like, the power dynamics between the United States and Latin American countries, that understand economic inequity, and that really, as they're thinking about moving, they're thinking about, how am I going to do this in a way that doesn't make problems worse, that doesn't, exacerbate gentrification, that doesn't harm the environment and, take away resources from other people, that doesn't create economic disadvantages. Like, how can I do this? So, from that premise, that's the client base that I work with, right? So when we're talking about moving to Latin America, I guess the first question I want to address is safety. So, these now that there's this Shield of the Americas, and we have what's her name, Ice Barbie,
Yeah.
running thing or whatever, and these drone strikes, and the possibility of building up military assets, which you wrote about in the region. How would you, if you were talking to people who are moving to the region and stay safe from the US, right? What
Yeah.
would you say? Like, what would be your advice?
Well, I always look at um, the Americans that live in Cuba. There's roughly 3,000 or so that have been there for a long time. And, because Cuba is just so deep culturally, and I don't know if that's what forced this or because it's such a smaller area, proximity wise. I see a lot of the Americans that embrace Cuban culture, they become members of the community. They support other people in the community, just like Cubans do. They help each other all the time. And I think that that's critically important. Like, if you want to be, it's not. I hate to use the word assimilation, right? But
Mm,
you know,
the
if you want to be
contribution.
right, if you wanted to be a part of the community, you have to become a part of the community, right? You need to understand, the cultures because Mexico, for example, is really big. And I always explain to people like Mexican food in southern Mexico is not the same as Mexican food in northern Mexico. Um, I know
Mhm.
people from Mexico from both, and the food is, substantially different and somewhat the same, and it's equally delicious. But I tell you have to understand like the regional and the local customs and things like that
Mhm,
because everything in the United States is built on this idea of assimilation, on this idea of whiteness, which is the absence
mhm,
of culture, the absence of heritage, the absence of a lot of these things. And these things are very prevalent in other countries, basically all over the world, but particularly in Latin America, where, you know, in most countries in Latin America, everybody has accepted the fact that we are colonized people. But, we didn't dictate who we were born as, but we still represent our cultures, our heritage, our food, our histories. Where in the
mhm,
U.S. we just don't really have that. A
mhm,
lot of people a lot of white people abandon their European cultures and heritage for the sake of being white, and a lot don't know. Are we Irish? Are we German? Are we everything? Like, you know what I mean? Like, so they just go by being white, and that absence of culture just doesn't exist anywhere else. I mean, Italy,
mhm.
Spain, everybody celebrates their culture in that sense, and you just don't have that here. So
Yeah.
if you're leaving the United States, you need to be open to the idea that you're walking into a whole different world. It's a
Mhm.
different environment, culturally, even how people get along and read each other is going to be different.
Definitely.
Yeah, and there's a large sense of community. There's not really so much individualism. I mean, there is, but the people are always there for each other.
Yeah.
And you don't have that here.
Yeah, no, I definitely have seen that and have and heard about like when we were here for a category 2 hurricane, which was not that big of a deal. But in speaking to people who were here for the like a major hurricane that hit over a decade ago, it leveled the islands in Cozumel, and
Mhm.
that person was telling me about how everybody that was able-bodied would come out and help each other. Everybody checked on each other, and like where we live now is this very small little rural village, and I mean, just like a minor example, my husband one time locked us out of the house and, needed a tool. And he like walked down the street to the little corner store and told the guys, hey, do you have a screwdriver? And they're like, yeah, sure. Just that old, it's almost that old school, like
Yeah.
what the neighborhood used to be is still here. And then, of course, you'd have like real cultural expression in like all of the holidays, all of the festivals, like all of the family gatherings and all of that. It's huge. And I think so to sum up your answer to my question, like coming into the country and being open-minded and I'll say, embracing the fact that
Right.
where you're going has a lot to teach you. Because United people from the United States, often we're indoctrinated to assume that we know better. We assume
Right.
we're told we know how to do everything the best, blah blah blah. And you have to wipe that clean as much as you can, and move into the space of, why are people doing this way? Like, what's the reason behind this? Because often you'll find that the reason behind it is so logical and so practical, and it makes so much sense for the context. And so, you have this opportunity to learn a whole new way of being that actually makes your life and everybody around you, better. And it's just like, that humility and curiosity and, like, desire to kind of learn and adapt and grow, is definitely key. But when it comes to military strikes,
Yeah.
people are still worried about, like, I guess I'm wondering if you have any insight into, well, first of all, can the US even afford to do what they're claiming they're going to do? Like, is the US really going to, you don't have a crystal ball, obviously, right? But, like, do you think that the US is even capable of, exerting the type of military control that it's warning about? Because I have my
I have my doubts too. Most Latin American countries, the people in those countries are not very thrilled about the idea of the United States being present there for
yeah.
obvious reasons. We don't have the greatest history, especially in Latin America. But, you see this even in Cuba where, they're so oppressed. No matter what Cubans want, the last thing they want is the United States in their country.
Mhm.
And before they had the election in November because Noboa wanted to put U.S. military bases in the country. They,
Mhm.
by and large, voted against that. I mean, it didn't even come close. You see it in Colombia. Colombia's been working with the United States for, I don't know, over 2 decades now on counter narcotics operations. And
Mhm.
during that time, cocaine production and smuggling has tripled. So it goes to show how effective we are. But yeah, even, even, uh, even then, that's or in Colombia, they all voted against like not having military bases. They didn't want them there, so they got rid of
Mhm.
them. And instead, the U.S. operates out of Colombian bases and joint operations. There's no individual U.S. base in Colombia anymore. And that's the thing, a lot of Latin America looks at Guantanamo in Cuba. They look at what Noboa did by allowing the U.S. and a couple other countries to do this joint strike not that long ago, right before the Shield of the Americas thing. You see that stuff, and it's just the people don't want that there, but then you have these leaders who are like, screw them, we're going to do it anyway. And I don't think they've seen the pushback against what the United States wants to do yet.
Okay.
I think you will see it. We've seen,
Yeah.
you know, Jamaica kicked out the Cuban doctors and stuff, or is going to, and there's pushback building in Jamaica against that, and in several other countries where people are rushing to get medical care before the Cuban doctors are sent away. So yeah, there's a lot of pushback against the United States in Latin America, and I don't think that they'll be able to accomplish. The military and stuff won't be able to accomplish what they think they're going to. I just think.
Yeah.
Yeah, someone said to me
Yeah.
that this first meeting of the Shield of the Americas will probably be the last of the Shield of the Americas, and I was like, I hope, I hope so. I really hope so.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, you got to think about the fact that MAGA is also, like, super incompetent on top of everything else. So, so there's that. We
Yeah.
have that going for us. Yeah. One thing that just came to mind when you were saying that, that I was thinking about, is what I have sort of absorbed and picked up, is that, I could be mischaracterizing this, but this is the way I'm perceiving things. The American perception of freedom, the mainstream American perception of freedom is like freedom to do whatever the hell I want to whoever I want, whenever I
Right.
want, without any consequences. Like the American definition of freedom is basically running wild with no accountability.
Right.
And what I see here is more like freedom is it's the freedom from, right? Freedom is not having anybody impose themselves on you, not having anybody dominate you, not having anybody control what you do or take your resources and whatever. And that's the kind of freedom that I like.
Right.
I'm not trying to impose on anybody else. I mind my business. I don't want to take your stuff. I don't want to make you do anything. I don't want to force anything. And I prefer to just, I just want freedom from. I don't want you invading my space. I don't want you taking anything from me.
Right.
That's it. And I feel when I talk to people, I feel like that's more aligned with the definition of freedom that I'm hearing from people here. Like it's more like, it's very live and let live here, where we live, it's very live and let live, but it's like, don't, just don't impinge on me. And
Right.
that's exactly what the US is doing. And I wonder, you know, have we not hit that threshold where, people are like, you know what, it's enough. And one of the questions that I get and that, I obviously take into consideration is when that happens, when people start to push back, are they going to target, or will people target, you know, expats, immigrants, people from the tourists, whatever, from the US as a proxy. And I'm curious, I don't know whether it's going to happen or not. I don't think it'll happen to us personally, because to your point, we speak Spanish. We are somewhat integrated. We know we're known in the community as decent people. Anything could happen anywhere, of course. But I wonder, has that ever happened? Like, has that in Latin American history, when the U.S. has done what it does with its encroachments, have there been like concerted efforts to sort of make USers pay? I feel like no, but I'd be curious.
No, I don't ask me why this made me think of this, and probably because I can't think of any cases like that.
Mm,
But excuse me.
gosh.
Um, there was a time when Confederates went to Latin America to try to start their own slave colony because they knew slavery was going to be abolished in the U.S. And they didn't come back. They disappeared. Those are probably the only cases I can think of.
Oh
Um,
my God.
yeah, so
Wow.
I can't think of any other cases like that. Because typically, and you even hear this from the Iranian government, like we're not trying to kill U.S. people, U.S. citizens. Cubans don't have any issue with Americans. Mexicans don't generally have any issue with Americans. Expats may be a different story because I have seen a lot of videos lately where people are getting mad at expats in Mexico for not embracing the culture, the different
Yeah.
lifestyle.
Yeah.
But to your point about freedom too, I often say that, freedom requires you to leave people alone. Um, if somebody's dressed like whatever across the street, you just leave them be.
Mind your
Um,
business.
right. I mean, and I think that's for us, it's kind of a product of growing up, like maybe in New York and New Jersey. Like I grew up in Jersey where, diverse
Hmm.
people, you have, all kinds of stuff that we used to think there were weirdos everywhere, but we left them alone. But um,
Hmm.
again, freedom, like for me, is you leave people alone, and then I would love to be able to not worry about going bankrupt over my health care. Right
Yeah.
now, or just there's a lot of things that you know people will say these countries are all inhumane, this government is repressive, this, that, and the other. But most of these governments provide housing, they provide healthcare, they provide, education and stuff. I'm like, is that really repressive? Because when you take those things away, now you're in the United States and I don't have access to free college. I don't have access to free healthcare or housing, even
Yeah.
even minimal stuff. So, if the United States would at least provide preventative care for people would live a lot longer, but they just won't.
Yeah.
We just won't do it here. And you always hear stuff like Bernie Sanders say, look at all these economically developed countries. They all have health care. And I always push back on Bernie Sanders a little bit. I'm like, most Latin American countries have some form of universal health care too.
Yes, they do.
They're
They
supposedly
do.
third world, right? They're supposedly poor, but somehow they can do it and we can't.
Yep.
Um, and I
That's a
think,
really good point.
right, like you hear, I've heard Petro say this, Gustavo Petro from Colombia say that, like, because their healthcare is covered and housing is covered, that money goes back into the economy. You have more economic activity, people have more access to funds for food and fuel. And,
Mm-hmm.
while it may seem like wages are lower in Colombia than they are in the United States, there are a lot of things people don't have to pay for there.
Yep.
And
Yep.
that balance has been a huge economic boost for Colombia, which is now the fourth largest economy in all of Latin America and the Caribbean. So,
Yeah.
like, you can't argue with results like that. I'm not saying communism or socialism, blah blah blah. I'm saying look at some of these countries that are capitalists that have figured out a way to do it,
Yep.
and like apply that here. I don't see why that's such an impossible thing. I have a
Yeah.
nephew who lives in Vermont. Vermont has universal health care. Why can Vermont have universal health care, but not Texas or California or Florida? Or it just doesn't make sense why you can't do that, even in a
Yeah.
capitalist society. So, yeah, to me, freedom is being free of a lot of things, like you're saying, and
Yeah.
for healthcare is one of those things I'd like to be free of. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're so right. I mean, the I can't, and I hate to like. I feel like I don't want to brag, right? I don't want to like
Yeah.
say this in a bragging way,
Right
right?
away.
Like, I'll be straight. Like I earned last year. I earned less than 1/5 of my last salaried employment position. Okay, and I still lived better than I was living
Right.
in the DMV area when I worked in DC, when I was earning at that time, this is like 15 years ago, whatever, I was earning like $80,000 a year. And back then that went further. And still I was living better because the costs of living there were so extreme. And to your point about healthcare, so I have a friend here who's Mexican citizen. She's born here, whatever, and I was asking her about the national healthcare system here, which we are eligible to participate in because we're legal residents, but we have to pay into it. Um, and she's telling me like she doesn't have to pay anything. Like it comes out of her taxes or whatever. But when she gets sick, she goes to the doctor. She doesn't pay anything. I asked her about how much was her rent because her house is like this small, cute little house. Um, she said she didn't pay for the house. The house is a government, like it was a government provided house. And it's not the same thing as like public housing. Like you have to be
Right.
poor to be, whatever, destitute, and you're only going to be in this little area. It's a cute little house on a cute little block that's down the
That's
street from
good.
the supermarket, and it's got a yard and she's got her dogs. And I'm like, oh my God. So now I understand how, what she earns is able to support her because she's not paying for these major expenses that we pay for. And then when
Yeah.
you talk about healthcare, we typically go to the private hospital here. Okay. That's two reasons for that. One is, like I said, we're not paying into the national thing yet. So we're not going to go and try to use the IMSS is what it's called, the national healthcare. Also, because I know the national system is under stress, right? Like there's a
Right.
lot of
Right.
people, that like that's their only option. And so why put my, US body in there and
Right.
like be another demand, right? I don't need to. But the fact is it's okay because even the private healthcare system here is so much less expensive. I
Right.
went and got a mammogram, and all my ladies in the comments, you understand this. I went and got a mammogram in Cancun. I paid out of pocket. It cost me the equivalent of $90 for a mammogram. That's unheard of. My husband had to go to the emergency room because he had an allergic reaction, right? He ate something that he didn't know had something in it. He had to go in, he was admitted, he was, IV, administered the drugs, observation, all of that. We left there having paid between the visit and the drugs, it was like altogether 150 USD.
Wow.
I
Wow.
mean, that's
That
what it
was
should be.
right. Like
Right.
you go to the emergency room here, it's 20 grand just to walk in. You know what I mean? So yeah,
Exactly.
that's nuts. That's nuts. Yeah, the last time I
And
went
it's
to
really good care. That's the other piece. And I will say this too. It's also important to note it's good care. Like when I go to see my regular specialist or whatever, my doctor hugs me. My doctor hugs me. Like they sit there and talk to you, they're like it's a different, it's wholly different. And for me, it's a 100% improvement. A hundred
yeah,
percent improvement. I mean, I remember talking to my daughter. My daughter was living in Connecticut at the time, and she couldn't get in to see a specialist for weeks. Forget how much it costs. She couldn't even get one. And it's not like that in the private hospitals here. It really is not. But yeah, I mean, that's a whole other
right.
to your point, like Latin America actually does have, and I made a comment the other day on somebody's thing about developing versus developed countries, right? And I'm like, when we're talking about a country being less developed, are we saying because they got potholes? And
Right.
because the GDP is lower, blah, blah, blah. Do you understand what development actually is? What infrastructure actually is? Infrastructure is having a healthcare system that can actually see people and that they can afford, right? Infrastructure is, you have fire departments that are appropriately staffed and are able to come and put out fires. Like it's just the way that people talk about developing countries. I'm like, yes, so there's potholes. I trip over them. Yeah, so the power goes out when there's a hurricane. Guess what? That's going to happen all over the United States because of climate
Right.
change. Y'all are all going to get to feel that. I felt it during Superstorm Sandy in New York.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh God, yeah.
it's just the when you think about some of the criticisms aimed at Latin America and the judgments, it just falls flat when you actually have lived experience to compare it to, and to compare to, in my case, I lived in New York, I lived in the DMV area, and I lived in Florida. I traveled all up and down the East Coast. I traveled all throughout the Gulf Coast for work. I've been to California. I've seen a lot of the United States. And there is no comparison in my quality of life. No comparison whatsoever,
You
and
know,
it's just, yeah.
it's funny that you say that because Reuters reported yesterday about the South Africans that Donald Trump gave refugee status to
Oh my God.
went back to South Africa because the quality of life was better and it was cheaper. And they also said the United States was too violent. What does it say when the United States is too violent for white South Africans? I mean, like, oh my God, like, holy cow. And that's kind of an eye opener. You know what I mean? Like, you got people from a former apartheid state who said, we are too violent and the quality of life was better. I'm like, bro, then if that's House Jenner, who's getting slapped in the face with that one, them or us? I feel like they got slapped in the face and went back home and they slapped us in the face on the way out. Like,
On the way out, right? Right. And meanwhile, Trump bent over backwards because he's like, you're my white supremacist base people.
yeah, they were so persecuted that they're running back home. And I have some readers in South Africa, and when I posted that yesterday, they're commenting in the thread on notes, and they're like, "Yeah, we saw it on all our local news." They said 1 in 3 have come back, but like 2 in 3 are prepared to come back. And I was like, "Oh my God, really? Like 2/3 of the people are about to go back? That's ridiculous."
That
And
is
yeah,
awesome.
so much for persecution, right? Like I was just like, we live in the upside down world. We really do.
It's
We really
hysterical.
do.
So
Yeah.
Emma says that right there is how to beat the rise of the right. Sell that. That was a really powerful way to explain it. Emma, are you talking about the healthcare comparison? Is that what you're referring to? Because yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point, and I'm going to let you go, Arthur, because I promised you I wouldn't take you more than an hour. But you bring up a really good point about the average person. I know this. The average, person is primarily concerned with how do I survive, especially in the United States now. How do I survive? So for us, survival was, that calculus was very, very much dependent on looking at racialized hostility and violence, right? Because we were an interracial couple living in Southwest Florida. Oh, Emma says that and the difference is like potholes. Yeah, like
Yeah.
the things that put Mexico into the classification of less developed are kind of like, no, that's a joke. Like
Right.
the thing, what is development? Yeah. Um, but most people are thinking about how can I afford my rent? How can I afford my healthcare? How can I afford to put, my utilities and my food? And that's like the thing that the things that the United States refuses to make possible for most people in the United States are things that are readily accessible to the majority of populations in most Latin American countries. And that's just, I mean, not to say there isn't poverty, but poverty doesn't mean you're starving. Poverty doesn't mean you have no roof over your head. Poverty doesn't mean you can't see a doctor.
Right.
you know and it's a different calculus, but I don't want to keep you longer. I know I really want you to get some rest
Yeah, I need it.
because
That's for sure.
I feel
I
like
was
you're always going and like you should get some rest.
yeah, I was telling you before we went live that I'm like on the verge of burnout, and
Yeah.
a lot of that had to do with me going scorched earth on all this anti-Cuba stuff, and yeah, I'm pretty burnt out, and I've been going viral a bunch, and that can be exhausting.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I was sitting here this morning trying to write an article about what's going on with Ecuador and things like that,
You don't have
and
to produce every day.
I know my wife said you're burning out. Like you really need to like stop for a
That's
day
a
or
good
two.
woman.
I do. I think she nailed it because yeah, I was for whatever reason I was up at 3:30 in the morning yesterday. Couldn't go back to sleep, so I started working, and I was like, "What am I doing?" So yeah, I was yeah. It's time to take a break for me.
It's
But
time to take a
this
break
was
and like do something nourishing and
right,
or nothing at all.
right, right. I
Stare.
gotta say, well, this was I really needed this. This was a huge help, to just kind of break the monotony of what I've been doing. But yeah, no, it was awesome. Like,
Yeah,
uh,
I'm so grateful for you to, your generosity to come on. I
no,
want to
thank you.
start paying people to come on. I'm not making enough money here to do that. So, but
Hey, I appreciate it. I was looking forward to it, and I say this as a married man. Don't take it the wrong way, but you have a smile that will light up a room.
oh, thank
So
you,
like,
thank you.
yeah, I was really looking forward to it. I'm like, this is gonna be good. I think, and it is. I appreciate
Oh,
this so much.
good, good. You need the infusion of the happiness.
There
Yes, yes. And as a Latino, it's have some fun, enjoy yourself, right? Okay,
Yeah,
so tap into
absolutely.
your cubano. All right,
Absolutely.
I'll
Awesome.
see you soon, Arturo. Have a good one.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.